6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Helen on to talk about her brand new book, The White Lady, the story of two key British Secret Service networks behind German lines. How you doing, Helen?
Great. It's wonderful to be on your podcast. Thank you.
This brand new book, The White Lady, I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write this story?
Well, it's been a long time coming. I mean, about 20 years ago, there were little bits known about the White Lady. There was a memoir written by one of the intelligence officers, Captain Landau, and I'd always wanted to write more on the White Lady, La Dame Blanche, a network in Belgium in World War One, and of course its successor in World War Two. But the files just weren't there. And I guess another block really is the fact that it's all in French. And so unless you're geared up to brushing up on your French, which I did to A-level, then it's tricky. And then the successor of World War II, the files have only recently started to be declassified. So it wasn't really possible to tell this story 20 years ago, but I knew it was significant. You get a feeling that it's significant, and significant because in the official MI6 history by Keith Jeffrey, it says that over 75% of all intelligence we ever got from behind the German lines came from this network. Well, actually, that's a quote from one of the World War One files. So, yeah, incredible. Now we can get to tell a bit more of this story.
And it's really great that we get to learn more about different areas of World War One and World War Two, because a lot of the studies have been very Franco-centric. So how have you been able to research some of these untold stories, particularly in Belgium, which we don't have a lot of information about compared to some of the other theatres?
It's true, and I think Belgium's going to be the next big focus. And the glimpse that I'd had through my career as a historian thus far is the sheer heroism of the women and men of Belgium. I wrote about the Comet escape line for my book on MI9, and you get a sense there of some incredibly young men and women, some as young as 16, 17, helping the Allies, getting our guys out from behind the lines. And then I sort of stumbled across one of the stories of the intelligence network in World War II, and I linked up with one of the families. And you just start peeking into those stories and think, wow, the heroism. And so I then started to make inquiries about what archives are available. And there are two primary sources for this book. One is the Imperial War Museum. Absolutely love working in their archives, love the museum. And the other one are the state archives in Belgium, and there are all kinds of institutions which hold state archives, if you like, the official state archives, and then there are the agents' files in an institution called Soma. So they're all part offshoots of official archives, and some of the stuff Belgian historians have worked on, but as far as I can tell, not many, if any, British historians have worked on some of these files. And so it's vast, not just on the networks that I talk about, but there are other networks in Belgium in two world wars that no one's touched yet. So it is an incredible country in two world wars, both, of course, behind the German lines, and being able to smuggle out awesome intelligence, eyewitness accounts. And for me, it is about the sheer heroism of the people of Belgium that I think hasn't really been truly recognised yet outside Belgium.
And I think it's fascinating that you have a country being, or people from a country being so central to intelligence gathering, not just across the Second World War, which we tend to focus more on, but also the First World War. Why is Belgium so important in both of these conflicts?
Geographically, they're significant. It's occupied in both world wars. And if we think just for the First World War for a moment, for the Germans to move their troops from Germany to the front line, to the Western Front, it's something we perhaps haven't thought of before, they have to cross two countries, either Luxembourg, which they occupy, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, or Belgium. And so the movements of the German army across occupied Belgium, if you can watch those train lines, so train spotting suddenly becomes really significant. It sounds very simple, but it takes days to move an army, and the field kitchen and all the equipment and the armaments and the horses. And you can tell they're going in stages, at least 2 to 3 days. They have resting places, and you can tell the direction they're going and where they're going to end up. So if you watch those lines, you can identify ordinary people on the ground, identifying the insignia, what kind of German troops are they, infantry, whatever, and how many will this field kitchen, there's so many wagons full of this, how many soldiers is this going to feed, gives you a size of the army in a particular area. And eventually, well, actually, if that's heading towards Lille or wherever, that's the area of the next front line, or Ypres, for example. So that's a vast front line to defend. And you do wonder, I mean, that war was so hard fought, with tiny bits of land given here and there, swinging each way. You wonder, if you take away the intelligence that we gathered from this whole train network, you just wonder whether we really could have pushed back on some of those German offensives, particularly in 1918, actually.
And I think, it's those kind of actions that we take for granted within war, troop movements and train movements and all the logistical elements, that is so important for intelligence services to gather and pass back. But when you're talking about how important it is to gather this information, how does the actual first network in World War One get set up? Because if you know that intelligence needs to be gathered, you do need a group of people to gather it.
Yes, and it starts in around December 1914 with a man called Dieudonné Lambrecht, and he was from Liège. Liège becomes quite a key central part that links up with Brussels, and then they have courier lines to Holland was not occupied in the First World War, so it was easier to station British intelligence officers out of Rotterdam and to sort of link up. But the people in Belgium, it came from within to start with. They start to gather this material, the reports, and then they try first to link up with French intelligence, and that doesn't work. And then eventually, Dieudonné Lambrecht, because he can travel, he's a businessman, he's an engineer, he can travel, he's got legitimate license to travel, even under German occupation, to travel over the border into Holland. And he goes into Rotterdam and really just turns up at the British and says, right, here I am, kind of thing. Sort of. I mean, that's a bit kind of vague, a bit kind of broad brush. But essentially that's what it is, and eventually that gets started. And there are, in his network, engineers, those that have been part of the telegraphic system, the whole telecommunications, I suppose we'd call it today. And then these people know each other, so they use very close networks of people they knew and trusted. And it starts to happen all over Belgium. So although they only start up at very small, by the end of the war, it's a vast network right across Belgium. And not only across Belgium, there are French agents which are coming in and out as well. They're going into Germany itself, which was something new that I learnt in both World Wars. They sent agents actually into Germany to see what was going on. And a lot of them, we don't know exact number, who went into Germany in the Second World War, but certainly you get a sense that they are covering vast areas of Germany as well, going in and out. It's quite extraordinary, actually.
And working across those territories is incredibly dangerous if you're working behind enemy lines. And a lot of the time when we look at this, we do tend to focus very much on what happens in World War II if the Gestapo get hold of you. But what's happening in World War One if some of these agents and intelligence gatherers are getting caught?
It was something, I learnt that I didn't know previously, was that the Germans were as brutal in World War One as they were in World War Two. I found that quite shocking. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised. I don't know how people behave in wartime, but certainly they had, like they did in the Second World War, they didn't have the Gestapo as such, but they had field police. They had those counter-espionage sections that knew that there would be people working for the Allies, and they captured some of them, 1 or 2 betrayals, so we don't get the same widespread betrayal as we get in other places, but certainly whole networks that were in danger of going down. And they're operating in regions hugely dangerous, and there was a price on people's heads if they worked for the Allies. So yes, we do have situations where men and women, in fact, Dieudonné Lambrecht himself was shot in April 1916 in the famous Fort de Chartreuse, Liège. Yeah, he paid for it with his life for running the network. But the extraordinary thing is, in spite of the fact that they had these crack teams, the Germans, really trying to hunt down, quite viciously trying to hunt down those working for the Allies, not just smuggling our guys out to fight again in both World Wars, but also knowing that they would be smuggling things out to the Allies, then, those men and women were prepared to start again. So Lambrecht's cousin, Walter Dewey, takes up the mantle. He's also an engineer, born in Liège. He takes up the mantle and becomes the leader of the new network, and he does survive to start it again with a very prominent lady in my book, Thérèse de Radiguez, in World War II. Ultimately, I don't have any spoilers, but ultimately he doesn't survive, but she does. And that's not necessarily because of his fault, but, it was a risk, and they knew that. And for me, I suppose that's why it underlines the sheer heroism of that nation. That's not to say there weren't betrayers. It's not to say that those were bystanders. But I think there's a lot unexplored about Belgium.
I totally agree, because when we look at both conflicts, we tend to just see Belgium as this conduit for the Germans to walk through. We don't necessarily think of resistance. And there was a thread there that you discussed that I wanted to pull on a little bit more. You mentioned the role of women within the networks in the First World War, and I think that's also a very understudied area at the moment, the role of women in intelligence networks in World War One. So what roles were these women taking up, and how were they playing just as an active role as the men within it?
This is explosive, really. In a way, we make huge assumptions what women have done, and just think of them as being homemakers, perhaps in the First World War, maybe ferrying the odd message here and there, but they were absolutely crucial. At least a third, from what we can tell of this network, at least a third were women of all ages. And yes, they're acting as couriers, they're running safe houses, but they're also on the board of, well, like a board of trustees, if you like, a board of governorship with the men. They are given equal status. They are leaders of intelligence sectors. So the whole of Belgium eventually is carved up into various invisible intelligence sectors. But they are heading some of those and completely running those agencies. This is World War One I'm talking about, and it goes on, of course, into World War Two. One of the conditions of working for the British, these men and women behind the lines, was they wanted to be militarised. They wanted to have status within the British Army. Well, of course, this had never been done before. Women have very few roles in Britain in the British Army. And here you have these Belgian men and the women wanting to be officially part of the British Army with ranks, no uniform, but with ranks. And the head of the network from our side, Captain Landau, he promises it. He says to them, he gives them a couple of days. I've said to the War Office, he works out of Rotterdam, I've said to the War Office, about this, and the War Office have agreed. War Office really being a cover for Mansfield Cumming. Later, of course, becomes MI6, doesn't it? But the Secret Intelligence Service, that first service under the British Secret Service, under Mansfield Cumming. So he goes back to these men and women, the leaders, and says, yes, that's fine. So they carry on, they swear an oath of allegiance, and they are given titles, lieutenant, sergeant, whatever. And it comes to the end of the war, and Landau had lied to them, because he knew if he waited for the War Office, it could take weeks, months. The War Office might say no, and then he'd lose all this intelligence. So these men and women are doing their best, risking their lives. And then at the end of the war, he has to go to Cumming and say to him, actually, you know what? I promised them militarisation. And of course, because they had delivered spectacularly on the intelligence, Mansfield Cumming just said, yes, that's fine. The leaders never knew any different. They got their awards and stuff, but they never knew any different. And the extraordinary thing is the women were given ranks of equal, if they were in that role, as the men. So there was this equality that we don't think about, and the risks, hiding radio operators later on, all kinds of things. They're writing reports. They're not just doing the clerical stuff. They are active behind the lines, and the men and the women are working together on equal basis.
I mean, that really shatters some misconceptions that we have about World War One, because, as you said, we do have this image that the women were just homemakers and looking after people after home, not getting involved in the nitty gritty. Now, there is a time gap between World War One and World War Two. Within that 15, 20 years, what are the people in this network doing? Because they've been so successful in helping the Allies defeat the Germans.
Well, that period is still quite hazy. We know that there was still some contact, potentially with Walter Dewey, who survives World War One. He survived, of course, took over after his cousin was shot by the Germans. So we know there's sort of some liaison still between the British Secret Service and the Belgian broader intelligence services. There's still files which haven't been released in Belgium about that, because I did look to put a chapter or a small part in my book on that interwar period, but the material just isn't there at the moment. But there was all kinds of liaison and work in the background, and there's a little bit in Keith Jeffrey's Official History of MI6. So that's about as much as we can sort of know. As far as we know, of course, they go back into their civilian life until it all kicks off again in a Second World War, and they're recalled, this mysterious figure. We only know him as Daniel, the British Secret Service. If anyone knows the real identity of Daniel, that would be fabulous. But for me, again, in this research, not to be surprised by what you uncover, we assume that this network starts again when Belgium's occupied. But the intelligence services thought, well, Netherlands, Holland, as well in the Second World War, it's likely the Germans are going to occupy them again. So the day that war breaks out, Walter Dewey is contacted again by the British Secret Service, and they start a really small successor network of just the top leadership. Thérèse de Radiguez is amongst them. She's a co-founder. She's now 74 years old. One of my heroines. She's amazing. You're never too old to start this intelligence network in World War II. They're working as an early warning system, which, I found fascinating. That this network begins even before Belgium's occupied again. And of course, when they're occupied in May 1940, it all kicks off big time in that Walter Dewey and Thérèse and others start really recruiting. And that's where we get a lot more agents on board. But you have this small group for about 9 months. And they are watching all kinds of borders. They're going a little bit into Germany. They are watching for any build-up of troops. And, of course, once they're on the border, they're about to invade. We had that early warning system. And for me, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions about what could or couldn't have been done to stop it. I don't know. I'm not a strategist. There may be others that have studied this part in more detail. But that, for me, was a really big find, discovery, an interesting link in World War II history that I didn't know before. And I think it's only just come out in the declassified files.
And within that, do we know, because a lot of the time we look at it from a British perspective, how the British interact with these units, do we know how the Belgian government were looking at this network? Because obviously now these people are in their 40s to their 70s. They're incredibly well connected. How are the Belgians looking at this intelligence gathering network?
So we know that Walter Dewey wants to set up some of the telecommunications ahead of any occupation. So he makes contact with various key ministers in government and the Belgian intelligence services. Sure, they are active in the background. I didn't actually work on their files specifically. There are just thousands upon thousands of files in Brussels that historians haven't got their head around yet for World War One and World War Two. But we know that the intelligence services were active in the background already. They, of course, go into exile and they start working out of London. Lepage was one of the key figures, Belgian figures. There was another figure working out of another part of London, and they linked up in exile. So they worked very closely with the British Secret Service, with MI6. So that we know. So in the Clarence Service, this is what the second network was called. It was renamed the Clarence Service. We know from their files where there's contact and correspondence with the Belgian intelligence agency in exile, but I didn't look at the full files of the agency itself. It's just humongous because they're overseeing. Well, it's hard to say how many networks, in actual fact. One estimate says there are over 40 different networks in Belgium in World War II. Some of them are intelligence, not many of them escape lines, but most of them intelligence resistance. They're just humongous. No one historian could possibly write a book on the whole. I realised that when I was doing this, thinking, I wouldn't even want to have a go at doing an overview of all of the other networks in Belgium. It's just massive.
And I think that brings up an interesting question, actually, about the sources, because the very nature of these networks, being gathering intelligence, they also have to have a degree of obscurity within the sources, and so do the British one. How does that impact the way that you can research and learn about these networks?
Yeah, there are always going to be gaps. So you do the best you can with what you have. So it can't really be a complete history, but we do what we can. And at the moment, the Belgians are just declassifying their World War II intelligence files. So I was very privileged, actually, to have sight of some of them early, because they said to me, look, we are going to release all of these files in tranches, but it's going to take us 5 years. Our estimate is 5 years. And they're about a year, 18 months in, and it's probably going to take them slightly longer. So they said, if you've got some idea of what you want to look at, which agents, if I've got the names of agents, which I did have some of them, they will have a file on them, and then sort of in that bulk there are other agents. So there are certain categories that I knew we could already look at, and then once I'd looked at them, they were then put straight into the archives. So they were almost like declassified, but they declassified whole tranches of other stuff while I was writing my book, and it's still ongoing. So nobody really knows how many there are in total. It's just vast. And then so you've got the official agents, and this was something I had to be careful in my research, to distinguish between others that helped these networks but weren't technically agents or couriers. So they may just, for a short period in the war, have acted as a safe house or couriered a little something once or twice, but they have a file, but technically they're not part of one or other particular network. So it's vast. So untangling all of this is a major job for the historians of the future, but it's vast. It's vast. And the Clarence Service isn't the only intelligence network. And we're not even talking about SOE and other resistance and sabotage. This group was not involved in sabotage. They were purely intelligence collecting. It's just vast, and equally vast for World War One, because I was very lucky to be given an index of the intelligence files that have been released for World War One in Brussels. It's A4. It runs to 420 pages. And each of those entries, they might have one folder, or might have 10 folders, or 3 folders. And you think, wow, you have to dive into that particular network or that one and just focus on that. It's vast. Nobody could write a complete history. You just wonder, you get a sense that Belgium might have been the most important country of them all at the end of the day.
It's part of the great thing about me being a modern historian is that we do have so many sources, but it is part of the downside of being a modern historian is we have way too many sources for us to look at. But then you were mentioning there when the invasion happens and Germany occupies. How does the Clarence network change and adapt to that? Because there's one thing being gathering intelligence when there's no enemy forces there, and there's another thing doing it when the Gestapo is breathing down your neck.
Yes, and of course they did have that, ironically, in World War One as well. For Holland, for example, then that was a change because, of course, they were not occupied in the First World War. So if you get over the border, it's easier. They can't do that in the Second World War. So they have to adapt. The spycraft develops. They start to film stuff, actually, capture photograph stuff, and very, very tiny miniature films. Somebody had one. Somebody got a collection of these, and I saw them recently. They're sort of tiny. You can't see like this, reels. Tightly wound up and then covered in like sort of paper and twisted they look almost like sweets. You wouldn't know if they were put in a tin. Amazing. And they were just smuggled out in whatever ways possible. But also they had the parachutists, a lot of Belgians who'd made it out and made it to London, and they were taken up. We're not talking about SOE. There were parachutists, they are called that in Belgium. So they are literally parachuted in. They are agents that are parachuted in, often for radio missions, because it took a while to get any radio link. It was well over a year, 18 months, before there was a radio link on the ground in Belgium with MI6 in London, with SIS in London, or even with the Belgian intelligence services. So they had to parachute in with equipment, highly dangerous missions. Many of them were parachuted into the Ardennes region of Belgium, and all that preparation and groundwork. So that was very specific, and they were not, and I do underline this, sabotage operations. This was separate from Belgian SOE operations. And there were, again, people don't realise, SOE operations into Belgium. So yes, it's different. They're adapting their spycraft, but I guess it's the same principle. They are watching and looking about what's happening behind those lines, and they are penetrating deep into Germany. And some of the Belgian agents are also going into Luxembourg, which is occupied again in the Second World War. So for me, I thought it's such fascinating research to realise that they're not just operating within the country where they're living. Some of them are actually travelling vast distances, particularly deep into Germany, and they're coming back with information on secret factories that used to make this before the war, but now they've got some very funny trucks coming out, kind of thing. And then one of the big pieces that I uncover, I think, for the first time really, is all this V-weapon intelligence that comes out from behind the German lines in Belgium in World War II. Extraordinary. Well, not all of it, but a good proportion of it was collected by the women. Thérèse de Radiguet, bless her, well in her mid-70s by now, by the middle of the war. She runs a whole sector. She's got male and female agents. A lot of the women, whole sectors of women, and they are bringing out V-weapon intelligence and installations and all kinds of things. Some of them are travelling from Belgium into France, around Calais. So they're not just agents that live and work around Calais, they're actually travelling distances. And they're invisible still. The Germans do not expect these women to be operating behind the lines. Again, it's that myth. They think they're going to be homemakers, they're getting shopping, they're going to the bakery, whatever they're doing. They're not spying, funnily enough, but of course they are. And again, they're very young, some of those women that deliver on that V-weapon intelligence. And what I was able to do from the files, we have the intelligence files in the Imperial War Museum, so you can see the messages that come out about movement of this train, V1, on these trucks, all that kind of stuff. But we don't often get a sense of which agent has done it. But then I went through some of the agent files. I came across one of them, Blondin, she was called. And it says at the bottom of her file, they noted some of the extraordinary intelligence that agents brought out. They don't always, but they said, economic, political. And then on hers it says, V1 installations, Pas de Calais.
And it's extraordinary to hear the depth of the intelligence that they're passing on to the British, and just how much that intelligence is valued as well. Because often we just think that the MI6, SIS are just getting reams and reams of information and not doing too much with some of it. So it's really interesting to hear how the British value it as well. But then There's also another service that you talk about within your book, which is Mill. How does Mill come about, and then how does it interact with Clarence?
This is one that I don't know if anyone's written about Mill. There might be fleeting reference in Henry Barnard's book. He's a Belgian who's written on these resistance. Yeah, Mill starts 41, sort of really getting off and going in 42. Said actually that those that started, it sort of comes out of Clarence. It is an SIS network. It's a sort of sister network, if you like. René Clippe, he's one of the key figures. He's sort of parachuted back in. Marquis is another. These two, radio operator and parachutist, going on this mission. And it's said that the difference, this is what I heard from the Belgian military archivists and historians, that some people found Walter Dewey's sort of the religious underpinning, because a lot of those that were part of these networks were Roman Catholic. They were religious. They were not fanatical or anything, but they were religious. They were observant. They would go to church, to mass. They might attend mass every day. Walter Dewey attended mass whilst in hiding every day. So they were religious. They were devout. They were patriotic. And the understanding is that those within Mill weren't quite so religious and didn't have the same strict authoritarian backdrop, if you like. That's what's said in Belgian sources today. And so it's almost like a breakaway or one out of. Reading the files, you don't get a sense that it was a breakaway. This is just extra information which I got from figures in Belgium. So it's still very unclear as to why it was necessary to found another network, because they do overlap geographically in places and started working for the Clarence service already. So it could be, they seem to be quite specialist in terms of some of the radio telecommunications stuff. So in World War II, they really did need those experts in radio telegraphy, all that kind of tech stuff that I never quite understand how it works, but they're developing all kinds of new radio sets and equipment and that kind of thing. One of the things that Mill goes on to do is to work out of a disused underground station or disused station, which they call Centrale. And again, the technology's not really clear in the archives, but they managed to tap into the German communications, the order of battle, if you like, just 2 or 3 days before it's about to happen. So this is what is termed real-time intelligence, if you like. And apparently it was the first time it was done. Again, that's what the Belgian historians say about that. So they're doing some pretty cutting-edge stuff in terms of intelligence, but they seem to be quite concentrated on the railways and on the communications. They're not just limited to that, but they're actually smuggling out intelligence in the same way as the Clarence service. And what we have today in the Imperial War Museum, all these intelligence reports, it doesn't distinguish which reports come from Clarence and which from Mill. So they may well be mixed up. Or it could be that there's a whole set of Mill intelligence files that we just don't have. That's just so unclear because it all hasn't come out yet. So I suppose if we were to look at it in 5 years' time, when all this crunch has made it in there, somebody else will have to come along and write another book after me on this whole subject.
And it's really interesting to see the intersection between the two groups, because as you said, with sources being released and files being released, it's only then that we can get a clearer picture. And it's so fascinating to see the developing history as the files are getting released. But then, you talk about smuggling out information, and it's something that we don't often dive into too often. But how are they smuggling this information out? Because, it's incredibly risky to go across the borders. It's incredibly dangerous to be found in the open when you're supposed to be hiding, or the Gestapo know your face. So how are they getting the information out of these intelligence reports out of Belgium and into Britain?
Well, some of that we know, some of it we don't. It's a bit clearer in World War I than it is in World War II. So I mentioned those tiny films. Again, it's still cutting edge, early stage of the research. They look to be authentic, as in we're not quite sure whether they were taken at the time or photographed afterwards. So all of these typed intelligence reports survive in the Imperial War Museum. But there are also a set of, well, we would loosely call it digital today, but someone's photographed on these reels. And I had a look at them for the chap that's got this archive, this particular collection, and they are identical to the reports I've worked on. And he's been trying to work out from the type of film and material and the way it's printed, he thinks it is original and that they did photograph it before any of the reports went out. And we know they smuggled them down the lines even as far, well, through Vichy France to Spain. And they would hide them in all kinds of ways. Really, really tiny. I think they hid things in like rubber tubes, bicycle tubes, wherever they could. So that's a very valid question. We just don't know all of the answers to that. They don't always give up their methods. We know in the First World War they hid messages in broomsticks, broom handles, well, wherever, in their corsets, in their loaf of bread. They would put tiny messages in potatoes, slits of potato, message, lob it over the wire. In World War II, no, it's different. And they also radioed, coded stuff back as well. So it's a mixture. You have some of the very short radio messages are a really succinct summary of some of the longer intelligence reports, especially on the V weapon stuff. But you have pages of it. Each report could be 25, 30 pages long, and they've got different sections. So Brussels, for example, it's not always in the same order. Hasselt, what have they seen around there? Oh, movement of troops, And then they would have another at Limburg, and then they would have Ghent or whatever, what they'd seen in the period that they're reporting on, usually at least weekly reports, sometimes a little bit more frequently. So they actually divide it up geographically. And now we don't know how they smuggled 30-page reports out. We know they were being stored in safe houses because the Gestapo nearly found some of them. But yeah, it's one of those areas we haven't quite been able to piece together from the currently available information, but huge risk, of course.
Yeah, and I've always marvelled how they've managed to get that amount of information out of the country. Now, what happens to these networks and the key people leading them after the war? Because there's not another world war that arises where you can lean upon these senior members again.
Well, Walter Dewey doesn't make it past 14th of January 1944. I don't want to have any spoilers for the book, but he tries to save Therese Radiguez, who's 79 years old, and she's fine, actually. Perhaps I will tell that wonderful story of Therese, where she's about to be carted off for interrogation by the Gestapo. Walter Dewey flees out the back of her house, down the street, and he's shot dead in the street. And there's a plaque today where he was shot. It's really quite something to see the place. It's slightly downhill as well. It's at the top of a hill with tram lines, and to actually see that sense of place where this happened, for me, was terribly important. And I saw, again, the plaque from Therese de Radiguez's house in Brussels. She was in Brussels in the Second World War. She was living in the countryside in the First World War. And to see that the building's changed, it's been rebuilt, but the plaque there. So you get a sense of a place, the rest of the street. But she's carted off by the Gestapo, and 79 years old, what does she do? She feigns senile dementia. And the Gestapo interrogators are like, oh, for goodness sake, who's brought her in? You haven't arrested this woman. She's old, doddery, she doesn't know what her name is, she doesn't know what day of the week it is. She was so good, And they let her go. And she goes on to run the rest of her intelligence network, the network that's delivering V-weapon intelligence for the rest of the war. She goes beyond the liberation of Brussels, because again, there's a sort of that other end. We don't have the intelligence reports beyond the end of August 1944. Again, maybe they'll be in the next tranche, who knows. But from that period onwards, we do know that this network is watching an army in retreat. It happened in both world wars. Those networks were crucial for gathering intelligence on the troops coming in. But also, what about those that are being evacuated, the wounded, an army in retreat, what their resting places, what they're taking with them? So that was really significant until the end of the war. After the war, I didn't follow through on what the surviving members did, except they did have. Moreau was one of the women who ran a sort of stay behind. She was a stay behind network. So yeah, that's much we just don't know beyond that. But there were important figures who were stay behind agents, particularly in the Ardennes region.
And it's really fascinating to hear when the files or the available files end as well, because that does, again, it gives more mystery to the story, but also it adds to the weight and the significance of these networks as well in telling us the story of what happens in Belgium in World War II. And I think this is a really nice moment now, Helen, to ask you our final fun questions we do for all guests who come on the podcast. Obviously, you've gone to such amazing places when researching for this book. You've seen some very powerful sites. What was your favourite during the process of researching for this book?
My favourite site? Do you know, I think it was the privilege of being taken by one of the families around the countryside, and it's going to be more than one site, to some of the hidden, and I won't say what they are perhaps, but some of the hidden houses and castles where these networks operated from. You get a real sense of place and a visual, and the sense of the distance that some of these agents had to cycle or travel or walk in some cases. It's very hard to see, even on a Google map, and you put it in A to B. Oh, that's 13 miles. But actually, when you are there on the ground and you get a sense of the terrain. So for me, that, I think, you start to understand the network, you start to feel something about what it was like. Very little seems to have changed in parts of Belgium. To me, it feels as though it could have looked like this back at the end of World War II, and that for me was special, to see the sites where this happened.
I think that's a lovely, lovely answer. And sense of place is so important for historians when we're writing. So I really, really like that answer. Now, obviously, we've only spoken about a tiny portion of your book. So where can people go and grab a copy of your book?
Yeah, all good bookshops. So all your Waterstones, your independent bookshops, we like to support them. If you're unable to do that, then you can order them online through Yale University Press, or also, of course, through channels like Amazon. But where you can, we like to support those independent bookstores. They're so important. Or you could look out for some of the history festivals, literary festivals that I'll be appearing at, and come and see me personally, and I'll sign your copy.
A signed copy is always fantastic. I love having a signed copy of a book. Obviously, there'll be a link for the book in the description below. And then if people want to go away and interact with you online, Helen, where can they go?
Yeah, I'm very active on Twitter X, so find me at Dr. Helen Fry. I put out a lot of very interesting threads, bite-sized history, really important to inspire and to use that as a positive space. And I'm also on Instagram, less active on Facebook, and I've got my website. Do have a look at my website as well.
Brilliant. Well, I'll make sure they're all in the description below as well. But thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.